Jean-Claude Van Damme was used to the attention. After all, his name was recognized across the world. His films, packed with intense action and powerful martial arts scenes, had made him a global icon. He was always on the move, traveling to different places for shoots, meetings, and promotional events. On this particular day, however, he was just looking to enjoy some time away from the spotlight. The bustling streets of the city were nothing new to him, but on this afternoon something was different. It was late afternoon, and Jean-Claude found himself walking through the city center. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the busy streets. People were scattered all around. Some were in a hurry, others just enjoying their day, and there was a quiet energy in the air. Jean-Claude was in no rush. He moved slowly, taking in the sounds of the city. He needed some time to himself, away from the cameras and interviews. The bustling streets were a familiar escape, but then something unusual happened. As he made his way past a cafe, a uniformed police officer standing near the sidewalk spotted him. The officer's eyes narrowed when he recognized the famous actor, but instead of feeling excitement or admiration, a strange irritation seemed to wash over him. Without warning, the officer stepped in front of Jean-Claude, blocking his path. Jean-Claude stopped and looked up, expecting the usual compliment or the typical "I'm a huge fan" response. But what he got instead was a sharp, rude tone. "Hey you, what are you doing here?" The officer snapped, his voice laced with frustration. Jean-Claude was taken aback by the sudden aggression. He had dealt with fans, paparazzi, and even skeptics, but never an officer with this kind of hostility. He calmly raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm just taking a walk. No trouble, just enjoying the day," Jean-Claude said, trying to diffuse the tension. The officer's eyes flared with an unexplained anger, and he took a step closer, towering over the actor. "I know who you are," the officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You're the guy who thinks he's some kind of tough guy, huh? Just another actor pretending to be a hero. Maybe I should remind you of how things work around here." Jean-Claude could sense the tension in the officer's words. He knew this was not a situation to escalate. Staying calm, he tried to remain diplomatic. "I don't want any trouble, officer," he said, maintaining his composure. "I'm just trying to enjoy some peace and quiet. I've got no issues with you." But instead of backing off, the officer's frustration continued to build. He clearly had something to prove. As the words between them grew sharper, the officer reached out and grabbed Jean-Claude by the arm, pulling him slightly to the side. "I don't like being disrespected," the officer growled. "You celebrities think you're above everyone else. You think you can just walk around doing whatever you want without consequences. I'm not going to let you get away with that." Jean-Claude, though surprised by the officer's sudden aggression, remained calm. He could feel the tension rising in the air, but he refused to let it get the better of him. He knew that reacting violently would only escalate things, but he also understood that sometimes it wasn't just about getting out of a situation. It was about handling it in a way that would send a message. "Please let go of me," Jean-Claude said softly but firmly, his voice carrying a calm authority. "There's no reason for this. I'm not your enemy." But the officer didn't listen. His grip on Jean-Claude's arm tightened and his body language became more aggressive. "I think you're forgetting where you are," he sneered. "This is my city, my rules, and you'll do as I say." Jean-Claude could feel the crowd's eyes on him. This wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. He was used to being the one in control of situations, whether on screen or in real life. But here he was just a man being pushed around by an officer who had clearly lost his temper. Finally, the officer shoved Jean-Claude back, causing him to stumble a bit. The crowd gasped in surprise. This wasn't what they had expected. Many people recognized the actor, and some were already pulling out their phones to record the incident. They weren't sure what was going on, but the scene was starting to draw attention. Jean-Claude had been shoved by a police officer in front of a crowd. The situation had escalated beyond words, and it was clear that this wasn't going to end without something happening. As the officer stood there, breathing heavily, clearly proud of his own actions, Jean-Claude slowly regained his balance. His eyes locked with the officer's, and for a brief moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. Jean-Claude wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He wasn't going to fight back, but he knew the officer's behavior needed to be addressed. "Listen," Jean-Claude said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not looking for trouble, But I'm also not going to stand here and let you treat me like this. The officer sneered, but he didn't reply. Instead, he took a step forward, clearly not backing down. The tension in the air was thick. Everyone around them stood still, watching, waiting. Jean-Claude knew this wasn't a battle of physical strength. It was about control. And in that moment, he understood what he had to do. He wasn't going to fight the officer with his fists, but he was about to teach him a lesson that he wouldn't forget. Without a word, Jean-Claude shifted his stance. He wasn't preparing to attack, but he was making sure that he could react quickly if needed. His calm, controlled presence was enough to send a message to the officer. This wasn't going to go the way he expected. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The tension between them was almost tangible. The crowd waited, holding their breath, wondering what would happen next. The officer, still staring at Jean-Claude with disdain, made the first move. He lunged toward the actor, his hand reaching out to grab him once more. But in that instant, Jean-Claude's reflexes kicked in. In a split second, Jean-Claude sidestepped, using the officer's own momentum to his advantage. The officer's lunge went wide and he stumbled forward. It happened so quickly that most people didn't even see it coming. The officer caught himself just in time, but Jean-Claude stood still, watching him carefully. The officer, now slightly shaken, looked back up at the actor. His pride had been wounded, but Jean-Claude didn't press the issue. Instead, he stood tall and waited. The crowd began to murmur, unsure of what to make of the situation. Some were recording, others were whispering to each other. But Jean-Claude had done what he needed to do. He had remained calm, and he had shown the officer that there was a better way to handle conflict than aggression. The officer, breathing heavily, finally backed off. Jean-Claude didn't say anything more. He simply turned and started to walk away, leaving the officer standing there stunned. In that moment, Jean-Claude knew that the situation wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who could keep their composure in the face of adversity. And he had done just that. But little did he know this encounter was only the beginning. What would happen next would change the officer's life and perhaps his own, in ways they couldn't yet understand. The next few days after the incident with the officer were strangely quiet for Jean-Claude. He didn't speak much about the encounter, and the news didn't cover it as extensively as he thought it might. Yet he could feel the eyes of the city on him as he continued his daily routine. What had happened on the street wasn't just a random occurrence. It had been a clash of power, egos, and expectations. And Jean-Claude knew that sooner or later, things would take an unexpected turn. In the days following the incident, Jean-Claude couldn't shake the feeling that the officer would not forget their encounter. He had acted in a way that was calm but firm, but the officer had been humiliated. Jean-Claude had used his composure and martial arts skills to avoid a physical confrontation, teaching the officer a lesson without throwing a punch. But he wasn't sure how the officer would process it. The actor was walking through the same part of the city again when he saw the officer from that day standing on the corner of the street. The officer was speaking to a few colleagues, but the moment their eyes met, there was an unmistakable tension. Jean-Claude felt the officer's gaze, and he knew it wasn't one of respect. It was the same anger and frustration from that afternoon, only now it was hidden behind a thin veil of embarrassment. As Jean-Claude walked past, he caught the officer's eye. He didn't stop or speak. He didn't want to escalate the situation again. But there was a certain discomfort in the air, something palpable that told him this was far from over. Jean-Claude continued on his way, his thoughts heavy with the situation. He wasn't one to look for conflict, but he also knew that there were moments in life when standing up for yourself was necessary. What had happened that day had been a wake-up call for both him and the officer. He had shown restraint, but that restraint had come at a cost. The officer's pride had been hurt, and Jean-Claude understood that a bruised ego could lead to unexpected consequences. The next day, Jean-Claude found himself in an unfamiliar situation.
He had just finished a shoot, and his team was wrapping up for the day.
They were walking back to the car when a voice called out from behind. "Hey, you!" Jean-Claude turned, immediately recognizing the officer's voice. He felt a sense of unease as the officer walked towards him, this time without any sign of hostility in his posture. The officer seemed different, more controlled, less angry, but there was something still unresolved between them. "I need to talk to you," the officer said, his voice softer than it had been before. Jean-Claude's first instinct was to stay calm as he had done before. He nodded, gesturing for the officer to speak. "You're Jean-Claude Van Damme, right?" the officer asked, his tone less accusatory now. Jean-Claude nodded again. "Yes, that's me. I owe you an apology," the officer said, and Jean-Claude could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I've been thinking about what happened the other day, and I realize now that I treated you unfairly. I was out of line." Jean-Claude, always one to respect those who admit their mistakes, gave a small smile. "We all have our moments," he said. "I didn't want to fight, but sometimes things get out of hand." The officer looked at the ground for a moment as though gathering his thoughts. "I was having a bad day," he admitted. "I had just come from a rough shift and I don't know what came over me. You were there and I just took it out on you. It wasn't right." Jean-Claude could see the officer's discomfort. The apology, though brief, was real, and it seemed like a genuine attempt to make amends. He understood that people weren't perfect. It was easy to be angry, especially in a high-stress job like law enforcement. But Jean-Claude also knew that acknowledging one's mistakes was an important step in growth. "I appreciate your apology," Jean-Claude said with a nod. "We're all human. Things happen." The officer seemed relieved by Jean-Claude's calm response. There was no animosity in the actor's voice, just an understanding of the situation. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," the officer said. "But I just want you to know that I've learned something from this. I've learned that it's not about power or control. It's about respect, and that's something I didn't show you that day." Jean-Claude smiled. "I think you've learned more than you realize. It's never about power. It's about how you handle yourself in tough situations." The officer nodded, seeming to accept the lesson Jean-Claude had imparted. For the first time, the actor felt that the situation was starting to close, that there might be some kind of resolution between them. "I won't forget this," the officer said, looking up at Jean-Claude with a hint of respect in his eyes. "Thank you for showing me what real strength is." Jean-Claude didn't need to say anything more. The officer had learned his lesson, and Jean-Claude had shown that sometimes the best way to resolve a conflict wasn't through physical confrontation, but through understanding, respect, and humility. As the officer turned to leave, Jean-Claude stood there for a moment, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. It had been a strange few days. He had learned more about himself than he had expected. The confrontation had been an unexpected test of character. In the end, it wasn't about proving who was stronger or who was in the right. It was about what was truly important in any situation: respect. For Jean-Claude, this was a reminder that every interaction, no matter how small, had the potential to change someone's life. The officer had apologized and shown a willingness to learn, and that was something Jean-Claude could respect. He hoped that the officer would carry this lesson forward in his work, and that the city would be a little better for it. The encounter had left him with a feeling of peace. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but he knew how to stand his ground. It had been a powerful moment for both him and the officer, and it was clear that for the officer the lesson would stay with him for a long time. As for Jean-Claude, he knew that his own journey wasn't just about movies and fame. It was about using his platform to lead by example, to teach when necessary, and to always treat others with the respect they deserved. With that thought, he continued on his way, ready for whatever came next. Life, after all, was full of lessons, and sometimes they came from the most unexpected places. The days that followed the officer's apology were calmer, but Jean-Claude could sense that something had shifted. His encounter with the officer had been a powerful moment, one that had shown him that strength wasn't just about physical prowess, but about character. He had hoped that the officer had learned from their interaction, but there was still a lingering feeling in the air. The lesson wasn't just about the officer, it was about Jean-Claude too. After all, being in the public eye meant that everything you did, every interaction you had, was scrutinized. Jean-Claude had learned long ago to handle such attention, but this situation was different. It was personal. The officer had challenged him, and in doing so, he had forced Jean-Claude to respond in a way that was more than just self-defense. It had been a test of patience, restraint, and understanding, but not everyone in the city had seen it the way Jean-Claude had. The streets were alive with whispers, and word had spread about the confrontation. Some people felt that Jean-Claude had let the officer off too easily, while others believed that the officer had overstepped and needed to face consequences. Jean-Claude, however, didn't concern himself with the opinions of others. He knew what he had done and he stood by it. One evening, while on his way back to his hotel, Jean-Claude noticed something unusual. A small crowd had gathered outside a cafe and they were staring at something, or rather someone. Jean-Claude walked closer, curious about the commotion. As he neared, he recognized the officer standing in the middle of the group. But this time, something was different. The officer wasn't in uniform. Instead, he was dressed in civilian clothes, looking out of place among the crowd. Jean-Claude stopped, unsure of what to do. It was clear that the officer had come to see him, but there was no sign of hostility in his demeanor. Instead, the officer seemed uneasy. He was holding a small piece of paper in his hands, and he was talking to the people around him, but his words were hard to make out from where Jean-Claude stood. Curiosity got the better of him, and he approached the officer, carefully making his way through the crowd. As he got closer, he heard the officer say, "I didn't know what else to do. I needed to find a way to apologize properly, to show that I understood what happened." Jean-Claude stood quietly behind him, watching. The officer had clearly been carrying the weight of their previous encounter. His pride had taken a hit, but it seemed that he was truly trying to make amends. The crowd, though unsure of how to respond, was silent. They weren't just watching Jean-Claude. They were watching the officer, too. His actions, his attempt to make up for what had happened, were just as much a part of the story now as the confrontation had been. The officer seemed to notice Jean-Claude's presence, and he turned around slowly. When their eyes met, the tension from before seemed to dissolve. There was no longer any animosity between them, just two people who had been caught up in an unexpected moment. "Jean-Claude," the officer said quietly, his voice uncertain but sincere, I've been trying to figure out how to make this right. I've been carrying this with me, and I thought I should come here and apologize properly, in front of the people I've let down." Jean-Claude raised an eyebrow, impressed by the officer's willingness to take responsibility. The officer wasn't just apologizing to him. He was addressing the public, acknowledging that he had made a mistake in front of others. It was a bold move, one that took a great deal of humility. "You've done more than enough," Jean-Claude said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't need an apology in front of anyone. What matters is that you understand what happened and that you've learned from it." The officer nodded, visibly relieved by Jean-Claude's response. "I know," he said softly. "But I needed to show that I was wrong. That it wasn't just about me, but about how I treated you. I've been thinking a lot about how I can be better, and I know I can." Jean-Claude smiled, a warm and understanding smile. He had seen this moment before, on screen, in the movies. But this time, it was real. The officer was not just playing a role, he was living out a moment of redemption. "I think you're on the right path," Jean-Claude said. "Real strength comes from recognizing your mistakes and learning from them. Not many people are willing to do that, but you are." The officer seemed to gather his thoughts for a moment before speaking again. "I wanted to tell you, the reason I was so angry that day, the reason I acted the way I did, was because of everything that was going on in my life. I was struggling with a lot of things I didn't know how to deal with, and when I saw you, I saw someone who seemed to have everything together. I didn't know how to handle that." Jean-Claude listened quietly, allowing the officer to speak his mind. It was clear that the officer had been battling his own demons, things that went beyond their brief encounter on the street. It was easy to see someone as just a figure, a stereotype, but everyone had their own struggles, their own battles. "Life is never as simple as it looks," Jean-Claude said, his tone thoughtful. "We all have our issues, our battles, even if they're invisible to others. That doesn't mean we have to take them out on the people around us." The officer nodded, and for the first time since their encounter, Jean-Claude saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the officer seeing the bigger picture. It was about him recognizing that the issues he had faced didn't define him, and that he didn't need to carry the weight of those struggles with anger. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, sensing that the moment was coming to an end. The officer, his head held a little higher than before, turned to Jean-Claude with a final grateful expression. "Thank you for everything," the officer said, his voice sincere. "You've given me more than just a lesson in humility. You've given me a chance to be better." Jean-Claude placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, offering a silent word of encouragement. He didn't need to say anything more. The officer had taken the first steps toward redemption, and Jean-Claude knew that was all he needed to do. As the officer walked away, Jean-Claude watched him go, feeling a sense of peace settle within him. What had started as a confrontation had turned into something far more meaningful. The officer had learned his lesson, and Jean-Claude had learned a little something about himself in the process. The encounter had reminded him that it wasn't about the physical battles or the fame. It was about the way we treat others, the way we rise above our own struggles, and the way we move forward from our mistakes. The lessons of life were always there waiting to be learned, and sometimes they came from the most unexpected places. Weeks passed, and life seemed to return to a sense of normalcy for Jean-Claude. The memory of the officer and their encounter began to fade, not because it wasn't meaningful, but because Jean-Claude was a man who knew how to move on. He carried the lessons he had learned with him, but he didn't dwell on them. The world kept moving, and so did he. One afternoon, while visiting a local park to clear his mind, Jean-Claude sat by the lake watching the ducks swim by. The serene environment allowed him to reflect on his journey, both as an actor and as a human being. Despite the fame, the films, and the admiration of millions, he often found peace in moments like these, away from the cameras, away from the hustle of his celebrity life. It reminded him of the simple things that mattered most. But as peaceful as the afternoon seemed, Jean-Claude couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to happen. He had an intuition about these things, something that came from years of navigating high-pressure situations on set and in life. And sure enough, that feeling was soon confirmed. As he stood up to leave, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was the officer, the same one he had confronted weeks ago. This time, the officer wasn't approaching with tension or anger. Instead, he was walking slowly, his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground. His movement seemed almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure how to approach the situation. Jean-Claude's first reaction was surprise. He hadn't expected to see the officer again, let alone in such an intimate setting. But as the officer drew closer, Jean-Claude could see that his expression was different. There was no anger, no hostility, just a quiet sense of uncertainty. "Jean-Claude," the officer said, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't expect to find you here." Jean-Claude smiled and nodded, gesturing for the officer to sit beside him. "What brings you here?" he asked, his tone friendly. The officer hesitated before sitting down on the bench next to Jean-Claude. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," he said, his voice thoughtful.
"And I wanted to apologize again."
"I know I've said it before, but I don't think I truly understood the weight of my actions until recently." Jean-Claude nodded, understanding the officer's need to make things right. "I appreciate that," he said. "You've already shown that you're learning. It's not always easy to admit mistakes, but you've done that." The officer looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "I've been through a lot in the past few weeks," he continued. "It's been hard for me to reconcile who I am with who I want to be. I've been thinking about what kind of person I want to become, and the more I think about it, the more I realize that I want to be someone who doesn't let anger control me, someone who doesn't lash out when things get tough. I want to be better than that." Jean-Claude listened intently, feeling a sense of admiration for the officer's self-awareness. Change was never easy, but the officer seemed determined to turn his life around. Jean-Claude couldn't help but think that, in a way, this was a chance for redemption for both of them, not just the officer, but also for himself. "You're already on the right path," Jean-Claude said after a pause. "The first step is realizing that change is necessary, and from what I can see, you're willing to do the work. That's important." The officer nodded, looking up at Jean-Claude with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "It's not going to be easy," he admitted, "but I'm willing to try. I don't want to be that person who lets small moments define me, who lets anger dictate my actions. I want to be better." Jean-Claude placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, a gesture of encouragement. You don't have to do it alone, he said. The fact that you're acknowledging it is the first step. I think that shows a lot of strength, and strength, real strength, comes from within. The officer's eyes softened and he gave a small smile. Thank you, Jean-Claude, he said, his voice full of sincerity. I know I have a long way to go, but I feel like I'm heading in the right direction now, and I owe a lot of that to you. Jean-Claude smiled, feeling a sense of pride in the officer's growth. It's not about owing anyone, he said gently. It's about learning from the past and using those lessons to shape the future. That's what makes us who we are. For a moment, they both sat in silence, watching the sun begin to set over the water. The air was calm, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chatter of people enjoying their day in the park. Finally, the officer stood up, ready to leave. I won't keep you any longer, he said, offering Jean-Claude one last smile. Thank you again. I'll make sure I live up to the person I'm trying to be. Jean-Claude stood as well, shaking the officer's hand. I have no doubt that you will, he said. Take care of yourself. As the officer walked away, Jean-Claude sat back down on the bench, deep in thought. The meeting had been a small, quiet moment, but it held a powerful message. The officer had been given a second chance, a chance to change the course of his life. And in some ways, so had Jean-Claude. He had learned that sometimes, the greatest strength wasn't in fighting or standing tall in the face of adversity. It was in helping others rise above their struggles. As Jean-Claude watched the officer disappear into the distance, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The encounter had come full circle. It had started with a confrontation, but it had led to understanding and growth. In a world where people were often quick to judge and slow to forgive, Jean-Claude had learned that there was power in compassion, in seeing the potential for change, and in offering others the space to grow. The sun had set now, casting long shadows over the park, and Jean-Claude stood up, ready to continue his journey. He knew that life wasn't always as simple as it seemed on the surface, but moments like these reminded him that every day was a chance to learn, to teach, and to make a difference. And as he walked away from the lake, he couldn't help but think that, just maybe, the officer's journey wasn't the only one that had been transformed. Months passed since Jean-Claude's last encounter with the officer, and life continued its unpredictable course. Jean-Claude's career remained as vibrant as ever, but there was a quiet peace in his heart that had followed that day at the park. The officer had made a decision to change his life, and Jean-Claude had done his part by encouraging him to keep pushing forward. However, what Jean-Claude didn't know was that the officer's transformation wasn't the end of their story, but rather the beginning of something much bigger. It was an ordinary morning when Jean-Claude received a call that would change everything. The officer, whose name he now knew was Michael, had reached out once more. This time the message wasn't about an apology or a conversation of redemption. It was a message of gratitude. Michael had been promoted, and with that promotion, he had been given the chance to teach. He was now tasked with helping other officers who had struggled with the same issues he had faced. He wanted Jean-Claude to know that his chance encounter had set him on a new path. Jean-Claude felt a sense of pride when he heard Michael's words. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected that his simple act of kindness, his willingness to stand up for himself, would ripple out and create such lasting change. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about a community of people, a whole network of individuals who could learn from the mistakes of the past. But this wasn't the end of their journey together. Michael had an idea, one that would not only bring him closer to Jean-Claude but would help others who were struggling. He invited Jean-Claude to a seminar where he would speak to young officers about anger management, self-control, and making better choices. The idea of sharing his experience and the lessons he had learned was an opportunity that Jean-Claude couldn't pass up. It was a chance to have an even deeper impact. Jean-Claude agreed to the invitation, and before long, he found himself in a large hall with rows of seats filled with officers eager to hear what he had to say. It wasn't a stage he was used to. He wasn't there to act, to perform, or to entertain. He was there to teach. It felt different, but in the best way possible. The officers in the room were there not just to hear a celebrity speak, but to hear someone who had lived through difficult situations, someone who had found a way to rise above. The seminar began with Michael speaking about his own struggles, about the way he had changed and how Jean-Claude's guidance had helped him see things in a new light. It was powerful to hear him speak, Jean-Claude was proud, but he was also a little surprised. He hadn't realized just how much his words had meant. Michael's sincerity was palpable, and it was clear that his journey was far from over. He had taken his lessons and was now in a position to help others. When it was Jean-Claude's turn to speak, he stood up in front of the group, looking out at the sea of eager faces. He wasn't nervous, but he was focused. This wasn't about fame. This wasn't about him. This was about giving something back, sharing a piece of what he had learned along the way. "I've spent a lot of my life in the spotlight," Jean-Claude began, his voice calm and steady. "But the truth is, the real lessons in life don't come from the movies. They come from the moments we face when the cameras aren't rolling, when we're alone, when we're struggling, when we have to make a choice between doing what's easy and doing what's right." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We all have our challenges. No one is immune. But what matters is how we handle those challenges. It's easy to fall into anger, to let emotions take over and make decisions we'll regret later. But the true strength comes from learning to control those emotions. It comes from learning to be the bigger person, even when everything around you tells you to fight back." Jean-Claude could see the officers in the room listening closely. There was a mix of understanding and curiosity in their eyes. He could tell that some of them had been in situations where they had made decisions out of anger, and others were just beginning to realize that they, too, had the power to change. "I'm not perfect," Jean-Claude continued. "I've made mistakes just like anyone else. But the key is to learn from those mistakes, to make amends when you can, and to keep striving to be a better version of yourself every single day." The room was silent as he spoke. Jean-Claude could feel the weight of the moment. This was no longer about him. It was about the people in the room who had come to hear his story, who had come to hear a lesson on strength, humility, and personal growth. It wasn't easy to change, and Jean-Claude knew that better than anyone. But seeing the faces in front of him, seeing their openness to learning, made it all worth it. As the seminar came to a close, Jean-Claude felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just the success of the day or the way he had delivered his message. It was the feeling that he had contributed to something bigger than himself. He had helped create a ripple effect, one that would spread through the officers who had heard his words and, hopefully, through the communities they served. Michael approached Jean-Claude afterward, his face glowing with gratitude. "Thank you for doing this," he said. "I've learned more than I could ever put into words, and I know the others feel the same. You've made an impact on all of us today." Jean-Claude smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "The impact was already there," he said. "I just helped you see it. You've taken the first step, and now you're in a position to help others. That's what matters." Over the next few months, Jean-Claude and Michael continued to stay in touch. They had become more than just a celebrity and a former officer. They had become friends, two individuals who had crossed paths in an unexpected way and helped each other grow. Their bond wasn't based on fame or titles. It was based on shared experience, mutual respect, and the belief that change was possible. As Jean-Claude reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the encounter that had started it all. It had begun with a confrontation, but it had led to something far more meaningful. It had led to personal growth, to redemption, and to the chance to make a real difference in the world. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that no matter where we come from, no matter what we've been through, we all have the power to change. And sometimes all it takes is a single moment, a single choice to set us on a path toward becoming the person we were always meant to be.